Hello, this is California Convictions. I'm Aaron Channel, and I'm here to talk about, well, prison stuff mostly, I suppose, but essentially anything anybody was interested in talking about. I know that the setup is a little bit different. I got the mic a little close to the screen, and I'm leaning on my lucky chessboard here. I'm going to be doing an interview with 30 to Life, and they're a 90-minute podcast. I'm just trying to figure out a way that I can sit comfortably and address the camera for that long, because frankly, sitting up for 90 minutes, like upright and straight, addressing a microphone, that sounds like a lot of doing. It's something that I haven't mentioned, but people have asked why I sit funny. And I had a friend, I guess is what I would have called him at the time, but he and I got into an argument. And I guess I said the wrong thing, or maybe we argued about the wrong thing. But he came up and he snatched me off that top rack and tossed me to the ground after he got in one clean sucker punch and knocked the cup of coffee out of my hand. And I guess he made his point. He was coming in for seconds. He tried to get some martial arts kick to the side of my head whenever I was getting up, but I scrambled back pretty quick, and my other friend jumped in, and the fight was over after that. He just wanted his cheap shot. I didn't realize it at the time, but it messed up my back. Something. It's all right, but... So now I'm leaning forward on my chess set just a little bit so that I can address the camera for a little longer. This works out for anybody who is interested in watching me today, because I'm going to go ahead and talk for as long as I feel comfortable. Usually I cut these off at a half hour because I can't imagine listening to me for a half hour. I suppose I'm entertaining and I do what I can, but thank you all for hanging in with me as long as you do. My podcast with Uso Ron is going to be on Friday at 1 p.m. I don't think he broadcasts them immediately. I think that he does some editing and then they go up on his channel. But it is exciting to be doing anything where I get to be heard by a couple more people. Incidentally, Celeste Girl and Matthew Alberico checked in before I started speaking, and Pedro Miguel is checking in now, and thank you, all you guys. I was thinking about compartmentalization, because that friend of mine, we'll call him Kung Fu, because he was such a big, he really made a big deal out of his martial arts skills, though he was late 40s, so his heyday was well past him, and he had an injury. But Kung Fu, he was in for spousal battery, as I recall. Perhaps it wasn't his wife. Maybe it was just a corporal injury to a bystander, something like that. But it was where there had been, I believe it was a woman or an innocent person. And he'd lost his temper with him and just went to town and beat him real bad. And so he was doing some time. It was only a couple of years he was doing, but he and I got along real well. We were friends. But I compartmentalized that fact that at some point in his life, he just snapped, lost his temper, and about beat somebody to death. Because that's what you do in prison. You have to take people at face value. Whenever I say to somebody, hey, what's up, I'm Aaron, and I'm in on a murder, well, geez, that's a moment where a rational person takes a step back and goes, you know, I'm not sure I want to be friends with a murderer. For all I know, that's just what you do, is you act like people's friends, and then after a couple of months, you kill them. No, I'm good. I'll go hang out with somebody who did some bank fraud or something like that. Similarly, you compartmentalize whenever this dude says, hey, what's up? I'm Kung Fu. I beat some poor woman brutally. You try and put it in the back of your head, you make friends with him, and you get along best as you can. He seemed like an okay guy, and he swore it was an accident, a mistake. He'd been all high on something or other and hadn't realized what he was doing. And as I recall, it was even in the context of a legitimate medical injury, wherein he'd injured himself pretty harshly and had been medicated whenever he hurt the woman. He never gave me the exact specifics. I never went over his paperwork, but the idea that this guy had an explosive and violent temper, I put it in the back of my head. So what? A lot of dudes in prison have an explosive and violent temper. Compartmentalize. Hey, my boy Tool is in the comments. I did time with him. We were in D gym together. The story that I'm telling off to the side about the professor and the freezers and losing my job eventually as the clerk there on ER at SADF, that is the next story I'm going to tell. Well, it ends with my getting moved to D gym. And man, that was a scary place to live. Dudes had knives there. I know it's SNY and it's supposed to be laid back and soft. People ready to kill people there. And Tool's a good dude. He and I did time there together, and we watched out for each other best as we could. Tool met Kung Fu, actually. Tool and I were walking the yard there on D Yard, and the guy was getting ready to parole then. It was just a very casual meeting, but I remember telling Tool as we were walking, hey, perk up, man, watch my back. And I didn't need to tell him twice. It's a serious environment. I just with 3 or 4 words, and he was on point. And I shook Kung Fu's hand. I knew his date was just a couple of months from then, because after he and I had our falling out, I didn't see him for a year or 2. Resuming the story of Kung Fu pulling me off my rack and smashing my back on that concrete. I'd compartmentalized to the idea that this dude just lost his temper, but rage occasionally. Because that's what you do in prison. My other friend, he was a good guy, and I know that he'd compartmentalized what I was in on because, frankly, a murder where allegations of torture were involved, it was alleged that I did truly awful things. That makes somebody pause. Jay was in on, and I'm really hopeful that I'm going to contact him at some point. He'll agree to do an interview because it's so incredible. He had worked construction and lost his job. Whenever he realized that he was no longer going to be able to make his house payment, he started looking around for any work he could do, and he found somebody that would pay him to move a bunch of dirt from point A to point B, essentially. The problem was that he didn't have the big bulldozer to do it. It was a big job. So Jay went and broke into the construction company that had previously employed him Friday, about 7 or 8 p.m., because he knew they shut down and stayed shut down. He did the whole big construction project that had been bid out for multiple people as a thing himself, because he was an operator. He knew how to use that piece of equipment. He got caught, not because of the crime. He got away with the crime clean and had already been paid for doing this job. It's just that he decided to take his nap on Sunday night and return the bulldozer very first thing early Monday morning, instead of returning it Sunday night when he finished. And the police were there because the owner had showed up just a couple hours early and noticed that things were screwy. That's what he was doing time on. It was, he'd already had a suspended sentence, but the 3 of us got along really well, and all 3 of us had to some degree compartmentalize the other dude's flaws, what they were in for. Similarly, the prison had the 3 of us set aside for our various issues. Jay had a pre-standing thing where he'd gotten into a fight with somebody that had clout in his gang, and he'd, tapped out and went SNY. Kung Fu, well, he, I think, was just maybe a little bit, he didn't want to do any time on the main line, and a little bit that his victim was an innocent bystander, a woman as I recall. Either way, he had decided to do his time SNY, and I've been clear about why I went SNY. I'd do it again if I had to, but it's definitely something that it taints your experience from then on. Anybody who meets you before and after you tell your story, because it's just a story, it's not like you can prove it's true. Well, what they really hear is, so you were an active inmate, you were part of the gangs or whatever, you decided to be over there, and then you tapped out. You came SNY. So off the bat, you're okay with hanging out with all the creeps on the yard and the other rats, because you probably told, right? Compartmentalize that, and the institution takes all of us and compartmentalizes us on another yard altogether. I lost my train of thought. It's so difficult to speak for long periods of time, but I'm trying to tell this story of Tool, who I meet in the comments a couple of months later. He's on D Yard whenever I get there, and he's a good dude. As soon as I landed, he saw that I had the kosher meals, and that meant that I was Jewish, and insofar as any group looks out for each other, he did what he could for me. There was a couple of other guys that all got moved to the gym, their D gym. They'd come from E Yard, so it was a new neighborhood. It's like moving from one apartment complex to another. All new people, more serious environment, more dangerous. They moved about 10 of us from the gym, and 6 of us were every single one of the Jews who lived in the gym. That's how I met Tool, is that we all 6 of us ended up at a new gym, and a couple of us ended up looking out for each other best as we could. I remember in the back of the gym, I had my 2 friends who really worked out. And occasionally Tool or I would go back there and try and hang out too and keep up, but neither of us had the stamina these guys did. They were back there doing burpees and lifting a bag. But because all 4 of us were Jewish, I called it Goldstein's Gym back there in the corner, and I always thought that was a funny little pun. The way that I ended up on D Yard was because I lost my job as a clerk. And I intend to in the next actual video that I shoot, and I know that everyone's been waiting for the culmination of the story with the professor, and I'm perhaps dragging it out, but it's an interesting story to tell. Once I finish that story, it ends with me losing my job and going to D Yard. Compartmentalization is not just something that we do in prison, like you have an experience and you realize that it's going to wear on you. Perhaps you see somebody get stabbed on the yard and you can't get it out of your head. You go back to the cell and you think about it and you think about it. You can say a sentence like, a guy gets stabbed. And I don't want to go into visceral or gory detail because the imagery is graphic and disturbing. But there's a lot extra to that. It's not like in television where Rambo takes a crossbow to the meat and he looks at the guy and tells him, "Oh, now I'm going to hurt you." Nor is it like in the movies where the death is instantaneous, swift and silent. It's like a fight if you've seen a fist fight, except one guy has a knife and it's one-sided. You fight for your life if somebody comes at you with a piece. Hopefully you live, perhaps you don't, but if you survive the experience, or if you just watch the experience, heck, if you're the guy with the knife even, at the end of the day, you take that experience and you put it in a little box because you can't allow it to overwhelm your experiences, what you do with your time. You could just think about it again and again and again, and that's how nightmares are born. Or you take that little box, compartment, and put it in a corner of your brain, and maybe it leaks out occasionally. A lot of guys in prison, it's obvious that they've been compartmentalizing trauma their entire lives. I recall I had an acquaintance, and he was an angry old man, essentially, late 60s. He was Vietnamese, as I recall. And he got into an argument with a youngster. Angry guy lost his temper, snapped at him, threw something. Youngster got up. He's not going to let angry guy throw something at him. And I really thought it was going to come to blows between a 20-year-old and an elderly guy. And the elderly guy was so angry, he spat on the ground. And there was a lot of profanity. But what he essentially said was, I'm going to die in here, and screw you for not showing me the respect I deserve because my life has been awful. He said, before I came to prison, my dad beat me like I was a man. And we're not doing time someplace like where I did time, because they beat you like you were a man there too. And I swear if I were 5 years younger, I'd beat you like you were a man. He spat on the ground again. A youngster, I guess, as disrespectful as that is, didn't have the heart in him, and I don't blame him for, taking it to 10 with a dude who was obviously not looking for a fight. He was just so angry. I have a couple of comments I'll read out if nobody minds. Pedro Miguel says, I think compartmentalization is an important topic. Regardless of the environment, I've never been to prison, but committed some serious crimes, some violent, or participated in the gang lifestyle. And compartmentalization is one of those things that you don't have to have been to prison. I think anybody who served in combat or who had a traumatic, life-defining event, and I don't know how else to describe it, understands this concept that you have the option of reliving that experience constantly, toying with it, maybe hopefully making peace with it, but having it really occupy your thoughts then and in the future. Or just putting it in a box and letting it leak out and getting post-traumatic stress disorder instead of traumatic stress disorder. Channel 5 says, it sounds a little like my mom. If she warned us it was a threat, if she was going to do something, the belt was swift. Cousin Cynthia, by the way. And, there was a whole generation of spare the rod and spoil. I'm pretty young. I'm 41. And I knew plenty of people whenever I was growing up. It was just the done thing. You hit your kids. And whenever those people were told, it was even more done then. And I'm not weighing in on a huge social issue. I try not to have opinions on things that are above my pay grade. But I can tell you, this older dude, I could tell from the way his voice cracked and how angry he was that it had stayed with him his entire life. I don't know what he endured, but he'd obviously been chewing on it for a really, really long time. I'm getting a little signal up on my YouTube that I may be getting buffered. I'm going to go ahead and keep talking and assume that everybody's listening, but if I am choppy, sorry y'all. JLE says, also, institutionalization is a huge factor. For the first time in my life, I just realized I was institutionalized. I didn't know because I was in prison for probably 20 years of my life since. Prison is a crazy thing because there's this harsh line in the sand drawn between your experiences before you went to prison and your experiences after you went to prison. It's like you are reborn in an absurd and awful way into a new environment. You get a new family there if you want it. New job. Sure is your new home. And then the day you parole, again, it is not a transitional change. It's not like you get out for a couple hours and go back and get out and go back and find your job. It is a line in the sand that is drawn that you will not cross again. New home, new job, new friends. If you are truly fortunate, you kept a family member or two or three that really kept the relationship alive when you were locked up. More likely, things are never the same. Even if you do reconcile with the people who wrote you off whenever you got locked up. And yes, that's what happens to almost everybody who gets locked up. That element of trust is gone. the assumption that they would be there for you, and perhaps the assumption that you would be there for them, because whenever these people call you up and say, listen, I need help, my home burned down, in the back of their head, are they remembering that they weren't there for you? Institutionalization is something that stays with inmates from, I suppose from the day they get there and they start learning the rules. I remember talking to a guy who had drawn out his ideal home that he wanted whenever he got out. The idea was that he was going to build this thing because he was going to work real hard and get the money, and he was just drafting what it was going to look like. And a lot of guys will do that kind of thing. You need something to occupy your hands and your mind whenever you're doing that much time. And if you have pen and paper, why not draft your dream house? It was a little cell. Just a little cell. I mean, he'd given himself a tiny little 10 by 15 room or something, bigger than a normal cell, but by the standards of any human, this wasn't a room, it was a cell. It was for somebody that's used to living in a closet. And then he'd drawn another one right next to it, another one right next to it, all the way around the big central meeting room, where him and his friends would hang out and play cards and dominoes and whatnot. And they had a garden outside, and I looked at it and I told him, dude, you know, this is a prison yard you drew, right? And it was, and once I pointed it out, he argued for no. Oh. It was just a very small dorm. It was for, I think he planned on him and his 12 friends or something like that, because that's how many rooms that he'd want to build. Having 12 cells in a day room in a little yard fenced off somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody who hadn't done time would have drawn that as an ideal environment. And prison isn't ideal, but you get used to certain social dynamics. You get used to things being a certain way. Oh. Now, Channel 5 let me know that it got choppy for a little while and that I'm back doing fine. That's good to know, honestly, because I have a flashing yellow bar that I haven't disabled in my streaming settings because I didn't know it would pop up whenever I was buffering. At this point, I'm out of any prepared content about compartmentalization. I just wanted to express the idea that I'd been friends with this dude, Kung Fu, that he had an anger problem, that he was prone to just lashing out and hurting friends, family. Until it came back and bit me pretty good, because now I don't sit normal. And that's okay, it is what it is. Prison is a place where you accept certain sacrifices, I suppose. They say that, was it Jefferson? I believe Jefferson said, he who would abandon his freedom for safety deserves neither. Well, inmates have the interesting contradiction in which that they have neither to trade. You have no right to freedom and no right to safety. You are where you are, and you rarely have the opportunity to change between the two. I'm trying to keep an eye on the comments to see if anybody has a question or a general line of thought that would be interesting, but I wanted to delineate some of the prisons that I served time at. I started doing my time, of course, at Mendocino County Jail, where you would expect anybody to start if they were coming from Mendocino. The thing about Mendocino County Jail is that it was a really old jail. I don't believe they use it for anything anymore. And it's not old as in it's literally falling apart around itself, like San Quentin, which is 150 years old, because it's just a county jail. But it means that there's no money. The tables were covered in rust. They were just pieces of stainless steel that had been left there to stain and eventually rust over. The windows were clouded glass, but the clouding had washed away enough that people could see out. And there were not enough beds. The jail had been designed to house far, far fewer inmates than were actually housed in the jail. As a result, every dormitory had 4 beds or 3 beds, depending on the design. And you were supposed to have an empty bed in each dorm. Rather, you generally had 4 people on the beds and then 3 or 4 more sleeping on the floor, depending on whether it was a weekend or what time of year it was. There was enough room to move around. I've heard tell of jails and prisons in other counties and other countries where people sleep so thick on the floor that it's impossible to walk in and out of the bedding areas. It wasn't like that here. I mean, you didn't have any real amount of personal space, but it was 4 dudes sleeping on a floor where there wasn't enough room to get around. You had to be very careful not to step on somebody. The food was abominable. First in quality, and jails often have poor quality food, and I'd been homeless a little bit before going to prison, so frankly, it wasn't the worst thing I'd eaten by any measure. But it was bad, and anybody who came there without the expectation of getting awful food, they'd convince themselves that maybe prison wouldn't be that bad of a place, and they'd get along okay. No, prison's bad and jail is plenty bad too. And you start with the food, it's your first meal. I was fighting a real case. I knew I was in on a murder from day 1, hour 1. So I wasn't hungry. I sat there in a little drunk tank between interview sessions. They interviewed me for about 2 hours. And tried to get me to say things. Really pushed. I don't know what people think the Miranda waiver works like and how you're supposed to question a suspect, but it was very much so, come on, let's trick him into saying this. And that's okay. It's how the judicial system works. I'm going to read a couple of comments and I'll continue describing my first meal in jail. Small-owned gambling man. Oh, small town gambling man. Wow, I butchered that. What would you say is your one very favorite thing about being free? Oh, I'm talking about food. And it's the first thing that I did whenever I got out was share a meal with my wife. And it's that. It's cooking and eating with the people I love. My boys, my wife. Food is a very, it's a visceral experience. And there's nothing like sitting down with people you really appreciate and enjoying a meal. Small town gambler man asks, what's one meal from prison you'll never forget and why? Man, that's a great question. I'm already answering it. It's going to be the first meal that I had whenever I was locked up. There was one other dude in the drunk tank. Huge, 350. And, excuse me, let me get a drink of water. There was one other dude in the drunk tank. Huge, 350. And I suppose a lot of it was fat, you know. I mean, I don't mean that he was a linebacker or a bodybuilder. But I was just as well happy that he was also drunk or whatever he was, because he slept right through my coming in there at about 2 in the morning until they served breakfast. And he rolled out of bed, must have been there for long enough to know what was going on, because he staggered to the tray slot without saying a word to me, took his breakfast, and staggered back to the little cot that he had set up on the floor. I figured out that this was food at this point. You know, they're opening up the tray slots, and the guy went and got his meal. So I went over and got mine, and I looked at it. It was 3 silver dollar pancakes. Silver dollar pancake is, of course, called that because it's about the size of a silver dollar. Maybe just a little bigger. Let's not be cheap here. But they were about the size of a silver dollar. And there was the equivalent of a scrambled egg. It's a dehydrated scrambled egg is what it is. So it doesn't actually have the consistency of normal eggs. It's a powder that's mixed with water and then cooked. but nutritionally it's similar. And there was a link of tofu meat. And that was the breakfast, and I'm sure that there are many environments where that would be a huge meal and people would be grateful to have it. And frankly, being as how I was in jail facing a murder charge and they used to just hang people, I ain't complaining. That said, I was hungry and I couldn't eat one bite of it. I had a bite of pancake and it was so dry and there was nothing to drink with it because they hadn't given me a cup. I looked at the other dude and he'd finished his meal. And I mean, he just, 3 big handfuls in because there wasn't a lot there. And I looked at him, hey, you want mine? And I know we never said one word because this was the opportunity for him to say something. And he went, That was it. It was a little grunt. And he took my tray, lay back down and went to sleep and was snoring immediately. They processed me into general population about 3 hours later. I don't know why he'd been there for so long or why I processed so quickly. Probably because I was facing a real case. They didn't want to leave me in an unsecured area. But once I was in general population, the quality of the food actually went up just a little. I figure that the food they gave guys in the drunk tank must have sat out for a couple of hours or something like that, because nothing else was quite that bad. Everybody lost weight there. There wasn't enough food to go around, but it wasn't quite that bad. Small Town Gambling Man asks, which of your former cellmates do you think the most about? Well, I actually think about my boy Scooby, or Shaggy, as he's actually called. And I called him the other name because I was trying to protect his identity originally. Quite a bit. He and I are exchanging letters, and I'm setting up a GoFundMe for him to try and pay for his lawyer someday. He's going to board on his case in, I think, 1.5 years. And whenever I do my interview in a couple of days on Friday at 1 p.m. with Uso Ron on the 30 to Life podcast, I intend to speak about Shaggy as much as I can because he was a lot of fun. I heard somebody describe him as a Huckleberry Finn type, and that's spot on. Dude had moves. He was always one jump ahead of the punchline. His name was Brandon Mays. That's M-A-Y-S, Brandon. And he would tell people whenever money got tight, because he did have money. He had a hustle, and he had another hustle, and he made booze, and his family intermittently looked out for him good. Like they'd send him a bunch of money and then send him none. Send him a bunch of money and then send him none. So when times were dry and he needed to come up with a move to convince people that he had more money than he did, he'd tell them that he was Billy Mays' nephew, the guy who invented OxyClean. Hi friends, I'm Billy Mays. Not because there was any truth to it, but as he explained it to me, but just because it's so brazen. And he does intermittently have enough money that nobody will think he would lie about it. And he was right. Anyway, he had never done a violent crime. He had nothing but burglaries on his record. And he was in on 25 to life. He'd been in for a couple of years when I started my term in 2001. He'd been in prison for burglary in 2001. I met him in 2002. I got an email from him yesterday. He's still in prison for burglary. I started a murder case and finished it, and dude's still emailing me from inside of an electric fence, and that is disgusting. So I'm setting up a GoFundMe for him, and he's the guy I think about the most. There are plenty of other cellies I did time with, good dudes, and I want to periodically talk about them, keep talking about them. I'm hopeful that the ones that got out, I'll eventually get them on the dang show and say, hey, this guy's this. That doesn't work. At the very least, the guys that are still in, I'm hopeful they'll exchange letters with me, because whenever you get out of prison, talking about compartmentalization. You compartmentalize the whole thing. Everybody does. It's a cliche in prison that your best friend that you would have stood shoulder to shoulder at the gates to hell with, well, he's going to get out and he's going to send you a package and he's going to give you a hug and don't worry, man, things are going to be okay because he won't forget you. And he does. Every time. 100% it happens. And it's okay because you compartmentalize prison. If you have that experience and you just always live with it, take it out of that shiny box and play with it, think about the terrible things that happened to you while you were locked up, it'll define your days. So instead, you build a compartment, compartmentalize. Take all your prison stuff, including your good friend Aaron, and you toss it in the box and you put it in the back of your brain. And that's what I did with Scooby too. I did. Until I started talking about stuff here on the YouTube channel. And it makes it really difficult to leave these memories in the back of your mind and pretend like you don't owe these men something. Because the fact of the matter is, I did time in that prison with them, and some of them, you know a man's character. Some I can't speak to. I'm not saying everybody in there should get out. In fact, I think prisons are built for a reason, and most of the men there should be behind very high walls, plenty of razor wire, and guards with guns. That is my opinion. I realize that some people are very pro-inmate. In the visiting room, occasionally they would shut down visiting because an inmate at the neighboring prison, the low security yard, had escaped. Universally, there was always visitors and inmates who were excited that somebody had escaped. Oh, good. Somebody got out. That's right. Heck with the cops. Heck with authority. Disestablishmentarianism, it's called. I don't like the people in charge. And I get it. Look, I was wronged by the people in charge. But these people, they obviously didn't have family who lived there in the town of Corcoran. Because whenever I heard that somebody escaped, all I said was, honey, be careful going home. Make sure you lock the doors tonight. And that is the appropriate response to you don't know who escaping from prison. It's a terrifying thing. A lot of guys shouldn't be there, and I hope they get out. Shaggy's one of them. He didn't put his effort, his time, his energy into finding a way over the wall like a crazy sociopath. Do you know what he's done in the years since I knew him, since he and I were cellies, and I described him as, you know, the heroin addict, that he was smart and slick and he had moves to get into drugs. First, he got clean. Then he finished his GED because he regretted not doing it when he was younger. And then his associate's degree. And he's wrapping up his paralegal certification after completing his second associate's degree. That's with NA and AA and all that stinking rehab that he's done to try and prove that he's not a threat to society because of that burglary he committed 28 years ago. Yeah, that's the dude I think about, and he should not be on that side of the fence. I'm going to go back to the comments. Pedro Miguel notes, I think you said your dad was a psychiatrist. My father-in-law, actually, and this is so interesting. There's so many little tidbits that I don't get a chance to talk about because it slips my mind and I haven't produced enough content to have gotten into all of the fascinating details. He was the board psychiatrist at San Quentin. He was the guy whose job it was to assess lifers, like Shaggy, and determine whether or not they should go home. He had a position of real authority, and he would evaluate inmates, help them with their psychiatric problems. He worked at San Quentin. I went through San Quentin. If I could have went around and asked people, hey, does anybody remember this dude, John Treffel? Then yeah, somebody would have, without a doubt. It's a small thing, but it did absolutely flavor my experience in prison. Moreover, a interest in psychology and psychiatry, it's my whole life. It's an interesting subject. If you want my frank opinion, probably a quarter to a third of it is absolute nonsense that people believe because it's convenient to believe it. But I'm not an expert. I'm neither a psychologist nor a psychiatrist, and I'm certainly not qualified to speak to the veracity or the consistency of their fields. Amy Oxner asks, did you ever have a prison guard make a positive impact on your life while locked up? If so, elaborate. There was a female officer, and she was a lovely woman. Say lovely woman and people hear that she's physically attractive. That's not what I meant to say, though honestly, she was mid-40s, red hair, shorter, and she was kind, consistently kind. And you don't see that from a lot of officers. And in fact, even some of her coworkers there at SADF in Corcoran, not nice people, at least not to inmates. She worked first watch. This means that she arrives at work at 10 p.m. and leaves at 4 a.m. This is a job in which you rarely interact with inmates. I had a suspicion. It was never verified, but it's my suspicion that she had that job because she had been too friendly with another inmate. Perhaps it's true or not, but generally, officers who work first watch, either they have a violent history, meaning that they beat an inmate just a little bit too bad, and so they're moved to that position because there is very little inmate interaction, or they have other lapses in judgment that result in them working that position. I could be way off base, but she was overly friendly, and she didn't seem to have the concern for being alone with me on such a regular basis. You see, I was the inmate clerk, and this meant that if anything happened between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. or 6 a.m. or whatever hours they wanted, essentially, and they needed paperwork done, I was the guy that did it, and I got called for a lot of random things that I'm sure weren't my job, just because I was on good terms with a lot of the first watch staff. She did a lot of small things that made my working those ridiculous hours way more tolerable. A cup of coffee, for instance, and I don't mean some special amazing thing. I mean out of the staff break room. But whenever you get woken up out of bed to go type something for 2 hours and you're trying to figure out what the heck's going on, it's a big deal. The thing that she did that actually, impacted me or that I walked away with was that she and I had a conversation where she offhandedly said, "Oh, I trust you." And she and I spoke a lot, and it was just some random statement like I said, "I wouldn't lie to you about this," when I was telling a story, because she'd often be in a position of sitting in a room watching me type for 4 hours at a time. I'm a natural entertainer, and so I'd talk. She interrupted, and she leaned in, and "Oh, I trust you," and it was a very natural thing that you would do with a friend or a person you were interacting with. It was not a natural moment with a subordinate, with an inmate to an officer. And I went back just a little and I told her, "Oh, ma'am, don't. This is a scary, scary environment. And you need to be careful here because these guys are liars." That was the end of the interaction. She never brought it up again, and nothing ever went further. For anybody who's interested, I worked with her for hours at a time, for months at a time, and I hope things went very well for her. But I'd been getting very relaxed in my environment. I'd been trusting. Trust is a slow and insidious poison in prison. So whenever I got home that day, I reevaluated some of the people that I was just dealing with. One of the dudes, turned out he'd been running a little bit more of a scam than I knew about, and he'd been keeping his dope right at the corner of 4 beds where one of the beds was mine. And I don't mean it was in my area, and I don't mean it would have been easy to access. It was in his area, and nobody could have stolen it. But it was close enough, and I really only did this big assessment of, well, what's going on here? Because I reminded her, don't trust these guys, and then reminded myself. Another officer that really impacted my life is the dude that gave me my paperwork whenever I was going to San Quentin. Paperwork's a big thing. Papers, please, is the saying. Basically, whenever you go to court and get convicted, they give everybody the same piece of paper. It's called your paperwork. And it just says what crimes you were convicted of. You can't send somebody to prison without letting them know what they're going to prison for. It's not just common sense, it's the law. So whenever you get to a prison, guys want to see it. Because if you're in on the wrong crime, and what type of crime is the wrong crime can change from one yard to another, from heck, even one generation to another. But I think we all have an idea of the natural response of an angry and violent man whenever he meets some nasty little piece of garbage that hurt children or innocent women or something like that. So we want to see your paperwork. Present it. And then people know what you're in for. Have a little conversation and you're all right, or you're not. I didn't know this was a thing. How would I? I've never been to prison. I don't have friends that have been to prison. I have uncles that did time, but I didn't interact with them a lot. I was a minor whenever they were locked up and never had a relationship with them as an adult. So I was getting on that bus without my paperwork, and they were stabbing fools there at Badger Section in San Quentin. I probably would have been all right. It's not like it's a ridiculous situation where they just get you as soon as you get off that bus. But he took the extra minute. He got it out of the mailbag and went and brought it to me and put it in my hand and said, "Here, Channel, you might need this." Because he knew what the system was, even if I didn't. Dobarchu Thanarkin says, "By the way, thought you could use a little extra people on your channel, so this is another me. This is Tool as well." Oh, that's very funny. Well, that's twice as many comments from that dude, right? Shaliste says, "You should message him about that." And Eugenia says, "What about non-guard prison employees? Chaplains?" You know, there are an incredible number of very devoted chaplains who go to see inmates. Each religion has services, but the only way that you get to meet indoors, that you get to have access to the actual chapel, is if an outside volunteer gets what's called a brown card. This is essentially just the state of California doing a background check on them, making sure that they are who they say they are, and that there's no, crimes in their background, no reason they couldn't go into a prison. If you have your brown card, you're able to supervise the inmates of your chosen faith. They're in the chapel, and it's important for these guys to have chapel access. Of course, since I attended predominantly Jewish services, though I did attend many others at one time or another, I was most interested in the rabbi that we had there at SADF. His name was Rabbi Sharon, and he was a good guy insofar as it went. I don't think the job paid very well. I think that it was a real imposition on his life to show up and do it. And I believe that after he got into a car accident and was unable to continue showing up at the prison and supervising us, he was sincerely regretful that he couldn't keep being our chaplain. Unfortunately, after he got left out, then there was no rabbi, and we no longer had unsupervised Jewish services for a while, which was a bummer. And that is the other half, is that if you don't have volunteers coming to the prison to help oversee the services of their chosen faith, well, then you're not going to have services for that chosen faith, or at least you'll have fewer of them. Pedro Miguel says, that's a special moment you shared with the red-haired officer. Magical and dangerous. And that is true, especially any time that there is a one-sided power dynamic. And our society is clear about this in a lot of ways. It's easiest to point out, of course, in relationships between adults and minors. But to a lesser degree, you see it in relationships between officers of the law and civilians, or their suspects, or criminals and correctional officers, teachers, professors, and their students, psychiatrists, or even just doctors and those they treat. These are all fields where there's a one-sided power dynamic. It makes for difficult and uncomfortable social relationships in a lot of ways because the rules are different and they can change without warning. And sometimes they can change without one of the parties even knowing what the change is. Channel 5 is curious if I feel any correlation between the COVID restrictions of today and the lockdowns that I endured. Essentially, I reworded his question, but yes. It's actually whenever they started using the word lockdown in American media that I really started laughing to myself. And I watched one or two other prison commentators, and they commented on also how different this is than a lockdown that they've endured. One of these days, I'd be curious to see somebody go through a real lockdown, because it's an unpleasant experience, but it is a humanizing experience. You have to remove all the distractions. Television, your radio, phone, computer. Close that door. Have enough food for a couple of weeks. If you have to, somebody can bring you food, but you can't talk to them. Say, hey, how you doing, Bob? Thank you. It's toss it in the door and leave. I suppose letters are okay. You can write, think. But all the things that you go, well, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll read my books, I'll clean my house. You have to stay on lockdown until those things are done. Because it's whenever you realize that you've done everything and you're not even bored anymore, you're just on lockdown. That's whenever you really grow in a way that's very difficult to describe if you haven't experienced it. That was the thing that was useful about a lockdown. That was the thing that made them worthwhile in their strange way. Without that, a lockdown is just imposition. It's imposition and small, torturous, petty sadism inflicted by life on your routine and the things that bring quality to your everyday experiences. Thinking about the lockdown, I wonder how people in prison are dealing with the COVID restrictions. I'm sure that visiting is entirely shut down and phones are difficult to access. Whenever they eventually do lift some of these restrictions for inmates, I guarantee you're going to see guys literally dancing on the yards. This is a population which comprises tens of thousands of men, and I'm sure many of them have literally been locked in their cell for the entire lockdown. They have ways of rotating who is allowed out, rotating who is allowed to see whom. But by and large, I'm sure there's been no social interaction for years for some of these men. It's the price they pay. That's what being a criminal is. You go to prison and you suffer. I'm not playing the world's smallest violin for these socially deprived convicts. but it is going to be a scene of great rejoicing. I really wish that I could have that eye in the sky to see Frank and Jimmy getting to run up and hug each other after not seeing each other for 2 years, even though they were brothers before things fell apart. Well, I wanted to let this live stream go for a little while and try and talk about the things that came to my mind in preparation for my podcast, which is going to be on Friday, and I sure am excited about it. I think I'm going to close here, and I just wanted to sincerely thank everybody for taking the time to listen to me talk. If there's any specific episode subject that y'all thought we're interested in, and I already have something on the Wolfpack at the top of my list that I'm supposed to make, as well as something on the quality of the kosher meals in prison, well, go ahead and put it in the comments, and I'll do what I can to get to it as quick as I can. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in with me today, and thank you for listening.